Welcome to IAG's webcast series, Selling Your Business, What Could Possibly Go Wrong. We're going to talk about the bad stuff first because it's going to happen most likely anyway, no matter what. So today's is our last episode of this series, and we've titled it, Why Deals Always Die.
Deals can die three ways. The first is by sudden heart attack, where they go into a quick death. The second is by accident, no fault of anybody's, and that's when they go into a coma. And by mistake, and it stops in its track, or it can be long and sometimes very exhausting. But in many cases, the deal can be resurrected, or they come back in the form of a new life.
I'm Jason Hullender, CEO of IAG M&A Advisors.
And I'm Joe Lieberman. I'm the Senior Managing Director of IAG Advisors. There are three causes of death. First is circumstances, outside anybody's control. The second is the buyer. The buyer may not be forthright. The third is the seller. It's really not unusual for a deal to die three times. I'd like to tell everybody to keep this in mind. This episode is about how deals die. It's not the fun stuff. It's not how they survive. We could talk about the great deals that go extremely well from start to finish, but that's not as interesting. So a little bit about IAG. We guide our clients who have built their companies from the ground up through a very messy, bumpy, once-in-a-lifetime moment. They find themselves ready to go on to the next chapter. They want to extract their wealth and transition their legacy. Basically, they want to cash out and go on that dream vacation. The problem is that they don't have the experience, the bandwidth, or the trusted advisor to get them through the process. And it's personal to me, as you know, Jason. I built my business from the basement of my home, and over 15 years, I grew it. But what I ended up growing was a very big engine that required a lot of fuel. I'm very proud of it, but I was exhausted after 15 years, and I felt like it was time to extract my wealth and transition into a new chapter. So I get it. I get the exhaustion. I get the wanting out. And I especially get the need for a guide to help our clients.
IAG helps prepare clients for the market. They identify the buyers, negotiate the transaction, and close the deal. We've guided our clients through hundreds of transactions for the transfer of billions of dollars in wealth. And Joe, in one of our war room sessions, you talked about a deal that really stuck with us. We call it Lead in the Land, and it's a story we're featuring today in this webcast.
Yeah, it's a story about how a deal can die by circumstances outside anybody's control. And it's symbolized to us that we will literally do anything to get a deal done.
Consequently, our clients extract their wealth and transition their legacy. And from time to time, we get to check on them while halfway across the world enjoying their time off.
It's my pleasure to introduce Jason Hullender, CEO of IAG, who literally grew up with this business as a child over 25 years ago when his father founded the business. He has been negotiating deals since he was in diapers. I think he's just been telling war stories on the playground, got used to it. Some of them are true, some of them weren't. But really, he knows M&A inside and out. Now he's running IAG, a successful M&A firm, with some very talented people who understand the complexity and the trials and the solutions to guiding us. And over the past few years, Jason has led our team to hundreds of acquisitions representing billions of dollars. So if you're looking for somebody who knows M&A, you've come to the right place.
I'll say this about Joe Lieberman, Senior Managing Director of IAG. Joe brings real-world experience with a wide variety of talents. We've seen him pull off some very challenging and complex transactions. He's accomplished this through the exit of his own business, writing 2 books, which I have a copy of both signed. Thank you, Joe. He's an M&A expert and a certified merger and acquisition professional, which is the gold standard in our industry. He's guided many clients through a wide variety of industries through their sale process. We're very glad to have Joe on our team.
Over this time, you have also guided IAG through winning several national awards. 4 years in a row, we have won one of Inc.'s 5,000 fastest growing private companies awards. We were the winner of the 2024 Acquisition International Best Global M&A Advisory Firm. That's a mouthful. And a few others which we keep polished. Essentially, we know how to help clients anticipate problems through the many bumps in the road, how to overcome them, and basically we become their shock absorbers. If they crash, we make sure they are not totaled and they're ready to go back.
We walk our clients through a once-in-a-lifetime experience, along the way helping them extract their wealth and transition their legacy. This is what matters most to us. Typically, many problems can occur both with great highs and lows during the process. It's such an important moment, and it's gratifying to us, sometimes even humbling. It's why we're so passionate about what we do.
Plus, we get to tell these war stories. So that brings us to today. We're going to cover what happens after going to market, identifying a buyer, getting an offer, and then not closing the deal. We call it why deals always die. It's not always a smooth ride. It's like running that marathon. The chutes don't fit, or they added an extra mile, or you don't have any water.
They don't always die. Sometimes they never get sick and everything goes smoothly. Sometimes they'll get ill but get better fast, and sometimes they don't ever recover. As we've learned in episode 1 and 2, a seller should be prepared for 1, the valuation shock, 2, having an expectation bias of the value of their business, and 3, be ready for a due diligence nightmare as they go through the process. Also, we talked about getting seller's fatigue, which is very real. Buyers are not always telling the truth, and sometimes we have to dig a little deeper.
And even being prepared for that, a deal can still die. And it's humbling to us to know that we can't count on everything. So Jason, let's get started with our stories.
Each of these stories are true, but the names and faces have been changed to protect the innocent. And I'll set them up, get them started. Joe will finish them. He'll reveal whether they actually died or if it was a false alarm or came back in another form. The first story today is called Lead in the Land. IAG met Roger. He was a 84-year-old, very young man, grew up working with his dad as a teenager, helping sort through scrap in the metal yard. And over the years, Roger transitioned into a large-scale lumber yard, generating about $60 million a year, consolidating lumber and selling primarily to construction companies in the area and multiple states and smaller other lumber yards. On the property, they had railway access with a rail spur about 50 yards long. They were pretty close to a major waterway, allowed for distribution of the lumber. This was the prototypical American business story. Built it from the ground up, a strong family union. Roger had built a small business in a small town into a small empire. Roger was a big fish in a small pond. Now, how's that for a kickoff, Joe?
It's a good start. This was definitely not a high-tech business. When I walked in there, they were still completing invoices on paper. They had typewriters. They had ribbons stored. They had binders all over the countertops. They had forms they were using in triplicate. It was like coming out of the 1970s. There was wood paneling from the 70s. The shelving was broken. Office staff were wearing clothes from the 70s. There weren't plants. I think there was even dust from the 70s. Roger's daily routine was the same thing he had done for 50 years. He came in, he reviewed the invoices, he placed the large orders, and then he would talk to major clients. Essentially, everything he did was routine. He was pretty old school, and it worked well. He never really thought about retiring, even though obviously he had to at some point. And at the age of 84, his family encouraged him to do that. But he didn't have an exit strategy other than selling the business. Before we got engaged, I met with him and his family 4 times. He had his wife, he had a son who happened to be an M&A attorney, which helped greatly. And we established trust and got to know each other on a personal level. To me, that is part of what this is all about, is to watch and witness what goes on with the people. Roger was a really tough cookie. He ruled his kingdom. He was a big fish in a small pond, as you said. He knew his business. He felt it had a very high value, and he wanted to look that buyer in the eye. So we got started. We put a full evaluation together. We put the offering memorandum together, decided on a price, and then we went to market. Immediately after that, we got strong interest, mostly from investment companies. And over the course of 2 years, 2 of those deals came and went. That's not the story. Then a large consolidator came in, company that was generating billions of dollars. Their focus was in hard assets, commodities. They sold to lumber yards. They had steel. They had other, as I said, hard assets, and they felt that this would be highly strategic. It would allow them to feed product into this company's client base and then expand the products, the lumber, et cetera, to additional locations that weren't already available. So it was a really good fit. What happens next was pretty much out of a movie scene. The owner of this billion-dollar organization flew in on a private jet. He had an assistant with him. He only had 2 hours and no time to go to lunch. So what we did is we toured the yard, we talked throughout, got to know each other, and it was very apparent that we had two very strong personalities. One who was the mayor of the town, and one who was a business mogul, like out of the TV series Succession. 2 hours later, we met in the office, that 70s style office. They had gained trust, they looked in each other's eyes, and they shook for a $40 million deal. And then off we went. This is when we started due diligence.
Well, they had a team of about 10 professionals. The due diligence process was organized into different categories like legal, financials, organization, human resources, environmental, and probably more than that, Joe, I'm sure.
Right. There were. Whenever there is property involved, it is standard to perform a phase 1 environmental study. This is usually a visual review, and knowing in advance that there was a fuel station on the premise, there was steel in the yard, and the rail spur that you mentioned, we knew they were going to do more than just a casual review, because what they're looking for is hazardous material and anything that might need to be mitigated before it's purchased. We didn't want it to happen, but it seemed reasonable, was what's called an environmental phase 2 study. This is where they bore holes in the ground at various levels. They would take the compounds, send it to a lab, and then they would study for certain materials. They zeroed in on the rail spur and the fuel station and a few other locations. And then we waited for the results. When they came back, what we found out was there was lead levels that exceeded industrial and residential levels. These were at levels that shut down towns. Everybody was surprised and very alarmed. But along with this came a heat map, a study of where they found the lead and the intensity of it. And it turned out to tell a very important story. Most of it was around the rail spur. We did some research, and after a while, we could start to understand what had happened. In that county, there were a few lead mines that were mined for the lead during World War II. They would take the lead, they would transport it by rail, and they would bring it to some factory where they would use it to combine into weapons. So, of course, there was lead. They had a rail spur, trains were going back and forth, and dust from the lead very likely seeped into the ground. And that's why it was there over 50 years. So it ended up stopping everything right in its tracks, no pun intended. There was a huge liability for this billion-dollar company, and rightly so. They weren't just buying a smaller organization. They had a lot of assets attached to it, and they weren't sure how to proceed. Now here's Roger. He's had this property for 50 years. He didn't know anything about it. He watched as his business thrived over time. Nobody got cancer. Employees worked well. There just was no alarm, and it wasn't his fault. He also wasn't sure how this could affect a deal since it had nothing to do with his business. Nobody expected this, both sides of the equation, of course. We weren't sure if we needed to report to the state. We didn't know how much the mitigation, the cleanup would cost. It could be in the millions. This billion-dollar corporation that was about to buy it was buying the property, and they saw it as too much risk. So the deal died. It went flatlined after we had negotiated everything. But there were too many questions for the buyer, as we talked about. They were actually considering moving to another property or walking away, or perhaps just waiting for the seller to clean it up. We're now 2 years into it, and Roger and his family were devastated. There was nothing else we could do but just wait, because we weren't sure what the buyer was going to do, and he was continuing to operate his business. 2 months passed, and the buyer decided that they would move to another property, and they wanted a lower purchase price. They wanted to value it in terms of the risk that they were taking on, because they were still taking material from a property that had lead on, as any negotiating party might do. Roger went from being a happy-go-lucky guy, the mayor of the town, to somebody who was extremely unhappy, and he was starting to lose weight. You could see the stress in him, and both parties were extremely frustrated. Over time, we were able to make a deal. We ended up resuscitating the relationship. We figured out how to work with the regulatory bodies, and we also identified what had to be done to mitigate the risk. A new handshake was made, maybe not as strong as the first one. And the weekend before the signing, Roger fell ill. His stress level was just too high. He went into the hospital. They kept him overnight. And then he ended up recovering enough for them to allow him to leave. On the day of the signing, I was there with his wife, putting his pants on while his son was on the phone, talking about the definitive agreements so that we could get him to the signing and have $30 million wired into his account. Roger is now on to his next chapter. He's very happy, and that's just how it goes.
Wow. That was really a David and Goliath type of story. A large corporation versus a small company. They found lead in the land. It almost killed the deal, and then went from the hospital to the signing ceremony. This is one of those deals where it died a few times during the process from circumstances that they couldn't control. Maybe Roger waited too long, but they definitely could have cleaned up the dust from the 1970s in the office prior to the buyer visit. The next story we're going to talk about it's called disorderly conduct. This is an example of how full disclosure from a buyer was not provided during the process. It fits into all buyers or liars episode. The client was a meat packing company that worked with processing cows, deers, hogs. It was a family-run business run by a husband and wife. They had built a great reputation over the decades. I had a 6-month backlog of work, and they also had a very profitable retail side of the business. They sold their own branded meats and specialty items, gourmet sausages, and high-end brats.
They were a really well-run company. They had over $1 million in adjusted EBITDA, and we expected a minimum of $3.5 million, possibly much higher, plus the value of the property. That's when the first deal died. There was a family that was interested. They came down, they spent time, we negotiated, we signed an LOI, and then within a couple of months, they decided they didn't want to move the family after that. Then the second deal died. A guy from a major metropolitan area came in. He had a relationship with the city ballpark. The city really loved the brats, enough so that they wanted him to bring them in and have his own location within the ballpark. But he needed the volume of product to be able to support this. He felt the meat packing location was a perfect fit to expand.
The last episode, we talked about a breakup fee. This story is the opposite scenario. The buyer wanted exclusivity to take the business off the market, but the owner had experienced 2 other deals that had died, so we decided that there would be a fee to take the business off the market. This is called an exclusivity fee. It makes the buyer put skin in the game, but the buyer never wants to put down any money, so it's a good sign when they do. This fee was $25,000 held in escrow by IAG. Both parties would then need to agree to release it, so it wasn't like, the seller had control of it or any one party. Joe, you want to take it from there?
As a matter of course, we do look for proof of funding. In this case, the buyer had funds, but they were part liquid and part illiquid. What I mean by that is that there was property in a home he owned that needed to be sold. The bank had already reviewed the situation and had given him conditional approval. Once he had sold the property, he would have the funds to make a down payment and continue on with working capital and have sufficient amount left over for any other contingencies. But the home was part of his mother's estate, who had passed away. It was in a good market, great neighborhood. There was great comparables, but he needed to have an estate sale first, and that took weeks to get done. So we waited. Then he put the house on the market, didn't sell as fast as we wanted to, and then it finally sold. Our seller is being very patient through this entire process. At that point, the buyer went back to the bank with a business plan as required and additional due diligence the bank does once they give conditional approval. They also include background checks. So that's when they learned more about his history. And his history included aspects that would prevent him from getting a loan. No loan from this bank and no loan from any other bank. So this deal died. And in this case, it was because of buyer non-disclosure. A few weeks later, Jason, I got this garbled voicemail, and I'm confident he was not sober. He wanted his escrow back, and we promptly returned it because we got permission from the seller. So we had to regroup. We had our mourning period. We grieved over it. Then we headed back to market. And weeks later, we found the right buyer. There was one situation with one of the partners that was involved. It got a little sick, but it didn't kill the deal. And then it finally closed.
Yeah, Joe, that's also what we say here is one buyer's no buyer. So luckily we were able to find another buyer after that one didn't work out. Another case of a deal dying 3 times here. It was not the fault of the seller, but perseverance made it happen. The next story is called Doctor's Orders. We had a family medical practice, one physician owner. They had several practitioners generating revenue for the business, had a great admin staff. The doctor only came in about 2.5 days per week, and he was ready to retire. He originally felt it could not be sold. He wasn't sure who would want to buy his business. He didn't see anyone else buying it, so we encouraged him to consider it and prepare for his exit. It was a healthy business. We knew there could be many buyers interested in a business like his, from consolidators to individuals. So, Joe, you want to take it from here?
Right out of the gate, we had great interest. To his surprise, we were fielding calls left and right. We had several interviews. And as we talked about before, with those interviews comes the beginning of seller's fatigue. And he had it. But we ended up meeting a consolidator who we would consider to be a strategic buyer. It's not unusual for an aggregator to build a model where they buy up businesses, in this case, a physician practice, where they would aggregate them and ultimately put them under a similar brand. So they were buying up these physician practices. They were putting better marketing tools into them. They had large contract with vendors. They would house all of the administrative work in one location. So there was a great amount of expense savings to be had. And as I said, it would eventually lead to a single brand. This particular group was backed by an investment group who was raising funds, not only for this purchase, but for others. And even though we had an LOI in place, we also insisted on an exclusivity fee to take it off the market. They agreed and everything seemed great. However, the investment group ended up not agreeing to paying the escrow until they had received SEC certification to raise additional funds. They didn't want to put at risk the certification by paying escrow and looking like they were spending money before they had the certification to do so. We kept on getting promises that it would happen every day for weeks. So we faced a dilemma. We wanted to get the process working, and we had a mountain of due diligence that we could get moving on, or we could wait. So we decided to put together the due diligence in good faith, and we had most of it put together. Then the buyer started asking for more and more information. It got into the personnel, it got into marketing surveys, and the doctor started to get impatient because we were still waiting for this exclusivity fee. That was his expectation. And at this point, he was requiring that the money be paid. But the buyer who was telling us that we had this SEC complication really couldn't understand why we didn't get it. We were already in the process of due diligence. Why did we not just continue? And on the other hand, the doctor thought that they were not being transparent. So both parties were getting frustrated. Eventually, the SEC certification went through and the escrow exclusivity amount was paid. This is when the two parties got together. They visited the location. They got along great. They were telling stories. It was like they fell in love. You know, they had this engagement. And now they were going to get married. They just couldn't understand why there was all this animosity. And then one day, the seller comes to me and he says that, you know, we've talked, the buyer and we get along so great. I want to handle all the communication from now on because it's just going so well. And we're going to close in 6 weeks. So I'll keep you posted. We're going through the paperwork. Let's just do it that way. So I was being apprised of this, and I saw the emails going back and forth between the parties. They could not finalize the agreement, and primarily because the doctor now decided that it was worth more, way beyond what we had initially negotiated. Finally, months later, I get an email from the buyer asking to return the escrow. They didn't end up negotiating the deal, and the buyer just walked away.
There you have it. Sounds like seller had an expectation bias and that the buyers had not fully disclosed their situation. The seller tried to go it alone and the deal ultimately died. We'll talk about the fourth story here. We had a countertop manufacturer in the Midwest. They did high-end, mostly residential countertops, had great financials. They were ready to go.
We call this the countertop conspiracy because there was something going on in the background that we didn't know about. I was personally very excited. They had a great showroom. It was very enticing. Customers would come in on the retail side, and it just was very beautiful. They had a design room where people could review materials and make decisions there. They encouraged interior designers to bring in their clients to talk about other aspects of building the home or refurbishing. At the same time, they knew that the interior designers would be recommending the countertops that were already in the building. It was a great strategic move, and it felt like a very comfortable place. The back of the building was clean and it was efficient. You could see the team of people working on countertops. They had it organized well. It seemed like from start to finish, they had their act together. And the financials proved it. There were two business partners, one for the front end who did the administrative work, and that was my contact. His name was Dennis. There was one in the back who did the operations and the installation, and his name was Xavier. I dealt with Dennis only. Everything seemed in order. When we started going, we had all the detailed financials. We put together the valuation. We put together the offering memorandum and then the teaser. We set a price and we went to market. Immediately, we got strong interest, mostly from individuals. And that's because it was of the size that an individual could get funded and run. It made a lot of sense for a single party. Within a few weeks, we had indication of interest. We call those IOIs. After reviewing, they wanted more information because we went to market just before the end of the year. And as the year closed, we were looking for more information. It was all very reasonable. So I got a balance sheet and updated financials. The P&L looked great, but the balance sheet didn't, and I had questions. Now, there were no accounts receivable on it, even though this was on an accrual basis. There were more liabilities. It just didn't make a lot of sense. So I was contacting Dennis regularly. He was telling me that it's with the CPA, he'll get everything fixed, not to worry. But he started to miss appointments, and I got odd voice messages from him, and then ultimately I didn't get any response. A couple of weeks later, I get a call from Xavier, is in the hospital for treatment of a drug overdose. That caused Xavier to get into the books, and then he discovered, unfortunately, that Dennis had been embezzling funds. Obviously, the business and the sale had to stop right then, and they ended up shutting down the business and liquidating all the assets.
Wow, that was a tough one. Also very rare. True death of a business couldn't be resurrected in this case. We're going to talk about the final story here. Do it now or die trying. Industry segments, fire restoration, HVAC, roofing are very hot industries, and we're finding a lot of buyers looking at those. Basically anything in the home service industry. And also tried and true industry segments like tire sales. IAG had a buyer group. They consolidated businesses in a certain industry segment. They buy businesses and absorb them into existing brands that they've already acquired. They asked for our help. They gave us their buying criteria by size, location, income, etc. In their experience, they offered higher multiples than we've solved from other consolidators for reasons we've discussed prior, like synergies, great efficiencies, and they can increase sales in these businesses. They had a very successful business model, so we went on the lookout for businesses for them to acquire.
This was a new engagement we had to fit the criteria of this buying group that you talked about. And based on the preliminary information, I thought it was a perfect fit. They were very profitable. They had a stable financial growth model. There was a long history, and we started to do the data gathering. In that stage, there's a lot of normal requests. We're looking for financials, tax returns, information about the assets, sales information by product, if you will, depends on the kind of business. In this case, that's what made sense. We get this information before we can do a valuation and before we send it off to market. At the same time, we had introduced it to this consolidator, and they were very excited. They had several more requests, and they were all very reasonable. at the same time, we felt we could go through the valuation, but also be responding in a way that would keep this consolidator buyer interested. So they asked for financials by location, sales by product type, and other details that also seemed reasonable. And if so, we were going to turn it around as quickly as possible. That's when I found out that their books were a mess. They were collecting data in-house, some of it from paper invoices, packaging it together, and then sending it to the CPA on an annual basis. This was at the corporate level only. They had no detail by location. It's a situation where you look under the hood, they have this great vehicle, everything looks perfect on the inside, the engine's running, but they're missing some parts. And then it becomes a completely different story. In this case, they weren't using a point of sale system to track by part. They weren't internally reporting by location. And Jason, it's not unusual for us to see problems initially in terms of how we would put a business to market. It's part of what we do. We bring in the support. We bring in strategic partners. We brought in a fractional CPA who could assist and get the books in order. And that's actually what we're doing right now. And now we wait.
In this case, Joe, the deal really didn't die. They just weren't ready to go to market. They needed to do some cleanup. Now they're going to be well on their way to getting the kind of deal I think they're looking for. Even though we had a buyer waiting, doesn't always mean it's buyer ready, right, Joe? The challenge, many sellers are up there in age. They built and run their business over decades. And in this particular case, we find out very late that they're just not ready and delaying the process by months or sometimes even years. We could go on. We have lots of stories, but this gives you an idea that deals can die for three reasons. One is the circumstances beyond the control, like the lead in the land, and sometimes those issues are found out in due diligence. Two is by the buyer. They undisclose their complete backgrounds. Three is by the seller, by going it alone or not being prepared.
We also know that a deal can die three ways: by sudden heart attack and having a quick death, like the countertop conspiracy story; by accident, and it's no fault, but they end up going into coma, like the lead in the land story; or by mistake. And it could be sudden or it could be long. And that's pretty much the tale of the tire story. We're just going to have to wait.
In many cases, deals are resurrected or they come back in the form of a new life. And it's not unusual for a deal to die three times. So now it's a good time to recap our 3 episodes of Selling Your Business, What Could Possibly Go Wrong. Number 1 is the valuation shock. Sellers usually have an expectation of what their business is worth based on a bias. 2 is valuations will vary, but the real value of your business is found when the market speaks.
From episode 2, we learned how deals get stuck. Being prepared for these inevitable bumps in the road will get you through the deals successfully. You really need to prepare yourself for seller's fatigue, the due diligence nightmare, and that some buyers actually might be lying or not disclosing all the truth.
And 3 is most deals die before they close. Sometimes they never get sick, but even if they die, they can always come back to life. Just because you have some challenges in the deal doesn't necessarily mean it won't come back. We have some time for some questions. Joe, how often do deals really die after all this?
Surprisingly enough, in one form or another, they do die about 3 times. Now, they come back to life, and that's why we're still in business, and we actually do close, and we have closed hundreds of deals. But what we call a death might actually be just another bump. We look like it can't be surpassed, but we end up doing it. It might be with the same buyer, or it might be with a new one. On average, there's usually, let's call it, 3 significant problems along the way. Jason, what is the typical time frame for closing a deal?
Typically, it takes about 6 to 9 months on average. We've seen some businesses sell much quicker, within 3 to 4 months. Sometimes they take a lot longer, like some of our other stories we illustrated. They needed to go back and clean up some things. Sometimes you find the issues when you get into the process, but on average, it's about 6 to 9 months. What do you do when a company is not ready to go to market or they have to pull back?
We'll be involved as much as is needed. In the case of the last story, we have one of our strategic partners helping this tire sales company put together the books and get it ready for market. Sometimes I have had experiences where I will actually walk the client through getting the financials ready to go to market. And we'll be very patient because we know ultimately that if we don't have those important questions answered, it's not going to sell. So we get patient, we pull back a little bit, and then we get support along the way.
Doesn't that maximize the value too, Joe?
Right. And sometimes there'll be situations where the buyer has an expectation or a desire to earn more than we think it's worth at the moment. Of course, you don't know until you bring it to market. And then we bring in growth specialists who will help them get prepared for the day that they can achieve their goals. Can you go back to market with different pricing to the same buyers?
Absolutely. If the business has done some things to increase the value, like clean up their financials or tighten up some processes, or even if they've hired a general manager that has taken some of the load off, all those things can increase the value. If they've pulled back and they want to go back to market after doing some of these things, we can certainly go to market with a different price.
Yeah, and we've done it, and sometimes it's substantially more. So that's all the time we have. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. We have this episode up on YouTube, and we'll keep you posted on season 2. Please be there for it. We'll see you next time.